Donald Trump's second administration has rapidly intensified pressure on Venezuela since January 2025, framing it as a war on drug cartels while pursuing deeper geopolitical aims. On the surface, the rhetoric centers on Nicolas Maduro's alleged complicity in narco-trafficking, with U.S. actions including naval interdictions, the termination of temporary protected status for over 300,000 Venezuelan migrants, and the abrupt cancellation of diplomatic outreach in early October 2025. However, a closer examination reveals a multifaceted strategy rooted in economic dominance, hemispheric security, and countering rival powers. Trump's explicit statements during his 2024 campaign, admitting a desire for Venezuela's collapse to seize its oil reserves, provide a candid lens into his priorities, echoing his first-term maximum pressure campaign of sanctions and recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaidó. At its core, Trump seeks regime change to install a compliant government that aligns with U.S. interests. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, and Maduro's socialist policies have redirected exports toward China and Russia, eroding U.S. leverage in global energy markets. A pro-U.S. regime would reopen fields like the Orinoco Belt to American firms, e.g. Chevron, which has partial access under Biden-era licenses but faces renewal hurdles. Stabilizing U.S. energy prices amid domestic baby drill pushes. This isn't mere opportunism, it's tied to Trump's America First doctrine, where Venezuela's oil could offset reliance on OPEC+ and blunt inflation from Middle East volatility. Geopolitically, the drug cartel narrative serves as a pretext for broader containment. Trump views Maduro's alliances with China and Russia as a direct threat to the Monroe Doctrine spirit, keeping the Western Hemisphere a U.S. sphere free of foreign adversaries. By August 2025, Trump issued a secret directive authorizing Pentagon strikes on Latin American cartels, explicitly targeting Venezuelan operations to weaken Maduro's military and economic base. This aligns with his fixation on migration, ending TPS and demanding Venezuela repatriate prisoners and mental patients, as stated in a September 2025 rally. Aims to deter flows northward, but it also pressures Maduro into concessions. Critics, including Venezuelan exiles and progressive analysts, argue this masks imperial overreach, likening it to pretexts for Iraq or Panama invasions. Economically, sanctions have already crippled Venezuela's GDP by 75% since 2013. But Trump's escalation, including threats of secondary sanctions on buyers like India, seeks total isolation. The endgame: a fragmented opposition unified under U.S. patronage, potentially leading to asset seizures and a privatized energy sector. Yet this risks backlash. Venezuelan militias, 8.2 million strong, and asymmetric defenses, drones, coastal fortifications, could turn any intervention into a quagmire, echoing Afghanistan. In sum, Trump's wants transcend drugs or migration. He envisions Venezuela as a subdued Petro vassal, its resources fueling U.S. primacy while denying Beijing and Moscow a Caribbean foothold. This hawkish stance, unburdened by Biden's multilateralism, prioritizes short-term wins over long-term stability, substantiated by declassified directives and his own admissions. Forecasting hinges on volatile variables: U.S. domestic politics, Venezuelan resilience, and global distractions. But current trajectories point to escalation with a 30–40% probability of limited military conflict by November 2025, per aggregated expert assessments. In a high-escalation scenario, which carries about a 35% probability, key triggers could include failed cartel interdictions provoking Venezuelan retaliation, such as an embassy false flag as claimed by Maduro, or Trump seeking a midterm boost via tough-on-crime optics. Under these conditions, the U.S. might launch drone or missile strikes on cartel sites inside Venezuela, killing dozens and sparking militia clashes, with Maduro declaring armed conflict and activating defenses. Sanctions would tighten further, halting oil exports and surging the humanitarian exodus, where 7.9 million already need aid. This could unfold in Q4 2025 with initial strikes, leading to a stalemate by 2026 that includes a U.S. naval blockade. A more likely diplomatic standoff scenario at around 50% probability might arise from congressional pushback, such as a war powers resolution, or an OPEC plus oil glut cooling aggression, potentially with Venezuela offering cosmetic cartel concessions. In this case, frozen talks could resume sporadically, with the U.S. deporting over 100,000 Venezuelans and worsening border chaos, while Maduro consolidates power via Russia and China aid. There would be no regime change, but U.S. firms might gain limited oil access through humanitarian deals, stretching ongoing into mid-2026 with incremental sanctions relief if Maduro steps down. Finally, a de-escalation or unlikely breakthrough scenario, with only a 15% probability, could stem from back-channel mediation via Brazil or Qatar, or Trump pivoting to a China trade war. This might result in partial TPS reinstatement and joint anti-cartel operations, allowing Maduro to survive but weakened, opening the door to opposition elections, potentially by early 2026 if a global recession forces energy cooperation. China and Russia, Venezuela's lifeline since 2014, providing $60+ billion in loans, oil prepays, are pivotal wildcards but constrained by their own priorities. For China, a non-military intervention is likely at a 70% probability. Beijing's $19 billion investment in Venezuelan oil secures discounted crude, 15% of imports, but exposure is waning. Defaults have soured ties, and Venezuela isn't fully in BRICS orbits. Xi Jinping's May 2025 pledge of firm support signals diplomatic cover, UN vetoes, anti-sanction rhetoric, but direct aid would be economic, fresh loans or firm investments, e.g., August 2025's $10 billion refinery deal. Military involvement? Unlikely at just a 10% chance. China avoids overseas bases in the Americas to evade U.S. encirclement, prioritizing Taiwan and South China Sea. If strikes occur, expect cyber economic retaliation against U.S. assets, not boots on ground. Russia, on the other hand, could take a more assertive but still limited direct role, with a 50% probability of escalation aid. Moscow's May 2025 strategic pact expands arms sales, S-300 systems, Sukhoi jets, and joint drills, viewing Venezuela as an anti-US bulwark. Putin could deploy volunteers or Wagner remnants for cartel ops, as in Syria. But Ukraine drains resources. Russia's Latin American footprint is symbolic, e.g., 2025 military diplomacy visits. Full intervention risks NATO backlash. Instead, expect propaganda amplification and oil barter to sustain Maduro. In a high-escalation scenario, their combined no-limits axis deters full U.S. invasion by raising costs, e.g., petrodollar threats, but neither commits to Djibouti over Caracas, opting for proxy support that prolongs the crisis. As Venezuela's neighbor and a U.S. ally hosting 2.8 to 3 million Venezuelan refugees, Colombia faces cascading effects from Trump's policy, exacerbating its own crises. On migration, ending TPS funnels deportees back through Colombia, straining its 10-year protected status program, covering 1.7 million. Conflict could displace another 1 to 2 million by mid-2026, overwhelming Bogotá's $1.5 billion annual costs and fueling urban poverty, e.g., Bogotá's refugee slums. For drugs and security, U.S. decertification of Colombia's anti-drug efforts, September 2025, links it to Venezuelan cartels, slashing aid and inviting sanctions. Border clashes rise, e.g., Venezuelan troops deployed August 2025, empowering groups like ELN. Petro's total peace with guerrillas falters amid U.S. pressure. Politically and economically, President Gustavo Petro's August 2025 rallies against U.S. intervention highlight sovereignty fears, cooling bilateral ties despite a July binational economic zone with Venezuela. Trade disruptions. Colombia, Venezuela, border commerce at $1 billion year, and refugee labor competition hit GDP growth, projected 2.5% in 2026. U.S.-Colombia coordination on Venezuela, urged in Atlantic Council briefs, could mitigate via joint patrols, but Trump's unilateralism risks alienating Bogotá. Colombia emerges as a buffer state, stabilized by U.S. aid if cooperative, destabilized by spillover if not. Petro's left-leaning stance may pivot toward BRICS for leverage, complicating hemispheric dynamics. Overall, relations deteriorate toward a Cold War footing, with U.S. warships patrolling the Caribbean and Venezuela fortifying borders. Success for Trump would mean Maduro's ouster without full invasion, e.g. via internal coup. But failure risks a Vietnam-like drain on U.S. resources, estimated at $50 to $100 billion annually. Venezuelan FM even gills September assurance of no conflict-seeking belies, preparations for hybrid warfare, tilting odds toward prolonged tension. Deep analysis, Trump's objectives in Venezuela, a contest of energy, influence and risk shaping the hemisphere's next chapter.